Hello, you beautiful degenerates, and welcome to Links and Locks, the Action Network's golf betting podcast. Alongside pro bettor Spencer Aguiar, I'm your host, Roberto Arguello, as we break down the Black Desert Championship, the third of 8 FedEx Cup fall events on the PGA Tour. Spencer, welcome back. What is your best bet for the Black Desert Championship this week?
I'm going to go with a long shot wager here. There was a matchup I liked. We can talk about it later in the show. Unfortunately, the number moved before we could air this. So I don't want to give information that's not going to be useful. I ended up taking Sami Valimaki plus 225 for a top 30. I also played that into a top 10 bet at 10 to 1. I think there's a lot of reasons to like Valimaki this week. You're maybe not going to see some of that inside of the short-term statistical profile. It's been a lot of hit and miss results, but the long-term return plus the small projection that I have in my model for the unknowns of this week did like him. So we'll talk about that in a second.
All right, we're at a resort course this week, the Black Desert Resort, and earlier in the season, we played on another resort course down in Mexico for the Mexico Open. That was at Vidanta Vallarta. And your guy, Sami Valimaki, finished solo second there. So perhaps he can keep that mojo going on the resort courses this week. For my best bet, I'm going with Ben Coles, who is at BetMGM, even money plus 100 for a top 40 finish. And at BetMGM, this bet includes ties paying in full. So I'll jump into why I like that bet in just a moment. But first, Spencer, why do you like slamming Sami Valimaki this week?
I'll actually double down on what you were going to say with Ben Coles here, and I'll talk about my model a little bit. So there were 5 players for me that graded inside of the top 60 for all 7 statistical categories that I ran. You're going to get the high-end favorites of Seamus Power, Patrick Fishburne, Eric Van Rooyen. There were 2 names that were the outliers on that list. One is your boy Ben Coles. The other one is going to be mine of Sami Valimaki. I thought there were a lot of similarities, and you're going to be hard pressed to probably find the same recent trajectory that I talked about last week with Michael Thorbjornsen when we talked about him on this show to come top 20. But where the similarities come into play is you get this really high ceiling from both of those golfers, and then a floor that, while it has been lower in the last little bit, I thought got that boost because of those reasons that I just talked about of him grading inside the top 60 of all the 7 categories that I ran. He ended up achieving that by landing inside of the top 30 in every single one of the main statistical categories from a strokes gain perspective when I weighed it for this course. And, we'll talk about some of the problems that we have from that statistical perspective in a second, just because it's not only a first time the course is going to be used on tour. This is a course that just got finished around a year ago. So there's really not a lot of information out there to talk about, but you hear that with Valimaki. This is a golfer that has been outside of the top 30 in 12 of his past 13 starts. But I do think that because of that reason, there are specific books out there. And if you price shop this number around, you're going to realize that there are different books out there in the legal space that have this vastly different from one another. And there's a couple prices out there that start mimicking this plus, 220, 225 total in the top 30. I think at the end of the day, though, and this is the big difference between Coles and Valimaki to me, Coles is one of the safest golfers that I have in my model. I think a top 40 bet for him is perfect. For Valimaki, because of this volatility that we've gotten from him, I would rather bet on as high end of returns as we can get. You could make an argument a top 30 here is not even going in the right direction, because this is probably more of that like top 20, top 10 sort of a route. But I thought this was such a great price here at plus 225 for a top 30 that I split the difference. Top 10 at 10 to 1, top 30 at plus 225.
Spencer, did you include the European Tour data for Valimaki?
I did not, but I mean, that is somewhere that has seen some improvements for him. Maybe not from a statistical perspective because I don't have the data in from it, but from a results standpoint, you do start getting some made cuts. It's not this dire outlook that has been seen on the PGA Tour of 12 of 13 not coming in the top 30. But, if you look at his only start that he has during this new stretch around part, and I guess this is the same season but during the fall here. I know that last result, while he made the cut, the ball striking was horrendous. He did it all with the putter. I think a lot of people are going to see that and be immediately off of him. But as I keep going back to, the driver here grades inside the top 30. The projected proximity is better for him here. And then I included a lot of weight for putting. And he was a golfer for me that had a positive trajectory mark for putting. So I think when you throw that into some of the European stuff that he has provided, there is a better outlook here than maybe a lot of people are seeing on the surface level of it.
Yeah, I know you normally don't include it, but just as a reference, if you're looking just at his PGA Tour results, hadn't played since the Open Championship or the Olympics, but since then, 4 starts on the European Tour, including a tie for 12th at the Czech Masters, a tie for 9th at Royal Kenny Down, and what a tournament that was. That was a blast to watch. And then made the cut also at the BMW PGA, missed the cut. So 2 results in the top 12, 2 where he was outside the top 50. I think playing it aggressively makes a ton of sense. And over those starts, including at the Irish Open, he was putting really well. And at the Irish Open, best putting week of the whole year. So even more credit or even more reason to be optimistic about the putter, which you said you've weighed significantly here. And I totally agree with these greens being 7,000 square feet. They're pretty big and bent grass, very pure surface. I think they're going to be able to fill it up if you're a really good putter. So we'll get into the course preview in just a moment. But for my best bet, we mentioned Ben Coles, a guy who, as you said, Spencer, just has a really high floor, comes in playing some great golf. Last year, he was the Corn Ferry Tour Player of the Year, but started off slow this season. And since then, he's really picked up his game. Overall, I really like him because, first off, he hits a ton of fairways. He is one of the most accurate drivers of the golf ball in the field, and he's been above the field average in driving accuracy in 19 of 23 tournaments so far this season, including 8 straight. So I'd be very surprised if, once again, on this resort course where the fairways are going to be pretty generous, I'd be surprised if he's not at least above the field average in driving accuracy. Once he gets in the fairway, very confident with his irons. His gain strokes on approach in 7 of his last 8 tournaments. He's not a super long golfer, and while the scorecard might be pretty long, 7,300 yards for a par 71, it's not going to play as long because you're in elevation and there are some downhill tee shots, also are some uphill ones. But I think it's going to be a fantastic golf course for him for that reason. And then once again, and then the putter, which has lost strokes the past 3 weeks, none of those tournaments were on bent grass. They were on Bermuda and POA, even though last week Bermuda was very, very pure. He has putted this season his best on bent grass surfaces. So I think it's the perfect time to buy on Ben Coles. I love him for the top 40 bet. And while if this was a tournament with some more top tier players, I would not really be interested in the outright market in Coles because there is no top tier player. There are no top tier players or even second tier players. You can make an argument there might not even be any third tier players in this field this week. Over the last 2 tournaments, the first 2 tournaments of the FedEx Cup Fall, the players who have won by gaining fewer than 3 strokes per round. And he's very much in the conversation to get there. He doesn't need to get to 4, doesn't need to get to 5, like you might need to get a major championship or a signature event win. It's a very different field. And because of that, I've also bet him at 80 to 1 to win the tournament outright. So really like Ben Coles this week. But Spencer, as you noted, brand new golf course, not just for us, but everybody out there on the PGA Tour. Not a ton of guys have played out here at Black Desert Resort. Very interested in seeing how the golf course plays. It's a different looking golf course than I think we've ever seen because the golf course is in the middle of the golf course is in the middle of a lava field. Yes, that's right, lava. So it's going to be stunning. You've got the Great Basin by you. You got mountains in the area as well. You've got desert. You've got lava. What more could you want? There's a little bit of water. There's absolutely no rough. Basically, there's very little rough, but it's 2-inch Kentucky bluegrass rough, so it's not going to be much of a problem. But Spencer, this week, what are you weighing in your model?
So there are always going to be unknowns about a course when professional golf hasn't been held in that state since 1963. That alone is going to be challenging the handicap for what Utah golf looks like in just a vacuum situation of that answer. But I think the construction of a statistical model does start generating more questions than answers for a couple reasons. And I just noted the one at the very beginning here. Like, this is a facility that just finished around a year ago it was the last course that Tom Weiskopf undertook before his death at the end of 2022. Roberto, I come on this show, I always give a lot of statistical data and we really get deep into the weeds with it. I'm not going to necessarily take that approach this week just because there are so many unknown variables. When I look at this venue, I do see a property that is very wide off the tee. You talked about the lack of rough, unless you're playing it into, one of those like lava boundaries. I think you're going to be okay for there. But at the end of the day, this is a venue from a scenic perspective. It's going to be beautiful. You talked about this running through a lava field. It's going to be surrounded by mountains. That factor provides one of the most impressive components any property will have all season. And at the end of the day, I wish we would have gotten a better field for this because from a television viewing perspective, it's going to be a great event to watch. It's not going to be one of those cookie cutter courses to where sometimes during certain stretches of the year, whether you're into golf architecture or you're not, some of these venues start looking very similar, specifically when we talk about these resort style venues to where birdie making comes in bunches here. This is going to be a beautiful watch on television. And I mean, I think the other caveat that's at least worth mentioning is it's going to be a venue that's over 3,000 feet above sea level. And I don't necessarily want that to make people think specifically of Castle Pines in Colorado. We just saw that as a first-time venue at the BMW Championship. That was a course where the elevation was much higher than that. We saw the average drive off the tee going over 330 yards. I don't think we're going to quite get to that answer, but at the end of the day here, this is going to be more elevation than we see pretty much anywhere else on tour. And, you talked about it, Roberto. You have a venue here where on the scorecard, 7,371 yards, par 71. It's not going to play nearly anywhere near that total. I think this is a short venue. I think this is going to be an easy venue, and it's going to be a very pure surface like you talked about on these bent grass greens. So this was about as much putting that I ever weighed into a model. I looked at bent grass putting. I looked at really pure surfaces of how somebody performed in that capacity. And I also looked at specific total driving marks. And that was not all encompassing of distance. I understand it's wide open, and I would rather prefer to have a long golfer than anything else, but I also think that there's a lot of ways to get around this course. And so for me, it was a second shot venue into really large greens. And then how could you make putts from there with that underweight of total driving there? And, that was one of the biggest weights I had the entire season of taking total driving approach putting, weighing it into one category, seeing where it weighed out. And you got a very standard expectation from there, at least looking at the top of the board. But, it keeps going back to when you're trying to find long shots, Valimaki, Holes, those were the names that continued to grade well in that facet of the game. Outside of that, it's like your Seamus Powers, Patrick Fishburns, Andrew Novak's, Steven Yeager actually popped for me this week, Doug Gims. So, there's a lot of different ways to go about this. I think, and I've said this before, Roberto, anytime that you get either a brand new course or a course with very limited data, and by limited data, I'm going to say like one time that we've held it there, or an event that hasn't been held there in years, we oftentimes as an industry put too much emphasis on categories that maybe did not need that much weight. And that's the one thing that I would just caution everybody out there. We can see this course that's going to look like it's going to play short. I think it's a resort style birdie shootout. You have these really wide fairways, but I think if you go into this and say nothing matters off the tee but distance, well, now all of a sudden you have a problem. Like I never want to build a model that is such a blueprint towards one strategy. It's supposed to be this broad outlook of it. And so, it was a lot of little small details that went into the stats for me. But at the end of the day, I'm also trying to find the best golfers. And when we get into the outright market in a second, I thought there were some mistakes made by the sports books. And sometimes in these watered down fields, you don't see that. So I'm excited to talk about that.
We'll jump into that in just a moment. I wanted to make a couple notes on the golf course. It's par 71, 4 par 3s, 3 par 5s, 2 on the front 9. The only one on the back 9 is the 18th hole, which should be fun with a golf course 72nd hole being a par 5 where there's going to be some movement toward the end of the round. Also, Tom Weiskopf, you noted Spencer was one of the architects on this project. He won the Open Championship in, I believe, 1973, which is at Royal Troon, same place that it was this year. So a little fitting that his course is opening the same year that Royal Troon hosts the Open once again. And he modeled the 17th hole at Black Desert Resort after the famous 8th hole par 3, the postage stamp. The one at Black Desert, I don't think he's going to play nearly as interesting because of a variety of factors. Lack of wind, first off. It's 30 yards longer, so the green is bigger. It's not as small of a surface. I think that was a big draw to that green, and then also the bunkers aren't going to be nearly as penal. I would love to see a new golf course on the PGA Tour in the United States that has bunkering like a links course from Scotland or in that general area. So I don't think that's going to play as interesting, but it'll be a fun shot and it'll be fun to see how it plays, especially if the winds do pick up. I like that. I also like on this golf course, Tom Weiskopf has two drivable par fours. You might remember the 17th hole at TPC Scottsdale, is a drivable par four right after the stadium hole, where famously a couple of years ago, Sahith Theegala hits his drive, gets a bad bounce, and goes in the water. He ends up losing the tournament. He's got Tom Weiskopf designed that hole, and he also designed this course, of course. And he loves a drivable par four. He says that's one of my signatures that moves as an architect. And there's one on each side, so that'll be a lot of fun. And hopefully, we'll be able to have extensive coverage of at least one of those holes, and also another hole that he designed or that he riffed on was the green specifically at the par 5 14th hole at Pebble Beach. Famous par 5, difficult par 5, where the green is elevated and on a plateau. Personally, that's the hardest par 5 I've ever played in my life. And he has incorporated a green that's very similar to that on the par 5 14th here at, excuse me, it's the par 5 9th, I believe, but it might be the 7th. I'll double check that one in just a moment. But very excited for that, to see some of the most famous holes in golf being kind of recreated in a modern setting and on a modern golf course. So very excited for the actual golf course. We've already noted it's in a beautiful setting. Spencer, let's get into your outright bets. You said you found a couple mistakes on the board.
So I run my model weekly to compare how a player is projected to play a specific course and then use that data to compare it to the rest of the field. That's not necessarily an abnormal answer, since any good model, or really any model in general, does the same thing. However, I bring that up because it's essential to realize the disparity of the field and not just look into the hidden rankings behind the model and say, for example, all number one players in the model are exactly the same or exactly as much better as the number two player in an event. It's one of those things where there are differences in the board and a ranking system doesn't tell the full picture of it. So when I started running a model for this week, I really did not know what to expect. Like, sometimes you get these wide open boards and, we keep calling it watered down fields, which it is at the end of the day. And just because of this lack of overall win equity, you kind of get this jumbled together board where all the prices are thrown into the same exact range and books don't know what to do with it. And for that reason, you kind of just get this board of a bunch of, like, I thought last week was a prime example of that to an extent. You just get a lot of the same thing and there's really not value at the end of the day. But I thought it was different this week. There was one player for me, and this is not to say that, and I want to preface this before we get too deep into this comment. This is not to say he is Scotty Scheffler. It's not even to say he's the Scotty Scheffler of this field. What I do want to at least note here, though, is there was one player for me that graded about as strongly as anyone has graded in a field this year when you remove Scotty Scheffler from the mix. And that's when you're comparing a player to the golfers that they're going to take on. So at the end of the day, watered down field, weekend tournament, if everybody's the same, then you're not going to necessarily get this answer. But there was one golfer that stood above everybody else, and that ended up being Seamus Power for me. He opened at 28-1. That number got hit immediately. I understand why. There's a lot of statistical data that really starts pushing you in his favor from both a long-term and short-term perspective. But he's generated 17 consecutive rounds of shooting par or better. He's also lapped the field in projected returns when you combine those categories of driving, approach play, putting that I keep talking about for this tournament. I thought he should have been sub 20 to 1 in this field. Like in reality, if you put him at 15, 16 to 1, I would have been okay with the total. So uh, anywhere that you can get right now is still going to be value for me. Not exactly what I was expecting at the end of the day, but in a tournament where everything is getting condensed into the same price range, at least at the very top there, this to me was one of the big mistakes that was made. So if you gave me one golfer and you said who's going to win this tournament, I would say Seamus Power. If that ends up being the answer for me, at least from a long-term outlook perspective here, you don't necessarily want to start peppering the top of the board with a lot of other options. Like I'm taking my stand with Seamus and we can build a card around that. There was one other name that was still in that sub 40 to 1 range that I decided to place a bet on. Patrick Fishburne at 35 to 1. This hometown narrative is going to run wild for bettors. That answer is not the reason why you want to be betting somebody. It very rarely works out that the hometown golfer comes into his hometown event and ends up winning it. You need a story for playability that goes beyond that. And Fishburne for me, and I would say Keith Mitchell is the third best golfer. I understand he's the favorite on the betting board, but I thought Seamus was the best golfer. Patrick Fishburne was the second best golfer. And then Keith Mitchell was third, with Fishburne and Mitchell being very close to one another there. But, this was one of those prices at 35 to 1, which is now down to 30 to 1, where I thought Fishburne had some value from playability just from the statistical perspective of what he puts together. So he ranked first for me in this course-specific par 5 scoring. He was the first name for me behind Seamus when I combined driving, approach, play, and putting. And as I talked about, I thought this number was probably about 10 points too high, give or take. Like 25 to 1 would have been the proper going rate for me. So even at these newer 30 to 1 marks, I really like him in this spot here. This feels like a better win equity position. Forget the hometown narrative. Let's throw that out for 1 second. This is a better course for him, in my opinion, to actually capture the title. And what ended up happening in my mind is because he underperformed last week at the Sanderson, we ended up getting a 35 instead of that opener of 22 or 25. So I bought in on the discount at 35, took Chandler Phillips at 70 to 1. I feel like that's a name, Roberto, you and I have been on quite often in a lot of these tournaments. Boomer bust profile. The driver has some concerns for me, but he possessed a top 10 mark for recent production in the key stats that I looked for. And then it's just two dart throws at the very bottom. And I talked about this at the beginning. There's 5 players that graded inside the top 60 for all 7 categories. Seamus Power, Patrick Fishburne, Eric Van Rooyen. That's going to be the other high-end name that's not on my betting card here. But those are the 3 names that if we want to call them 30, 35 to 1 or less. And then it's the 2 long shot options of Ben Coles at 85 to 1 and Sami Valimaki at 125 to 1. I am trying to figure out a different way to play Coles, and maybe that top 40 bet is the route to go with it. I really like your wager there. I'm not a person that lays a lot of juice. I also thought him to make the cut in that minus 190 range was about 50 points off. Not necessarily the market that I normally drift to there, but there's a lot of safety with Coles. But with that safety also comes a little bit of upside. I would say the profile for Valimaki is much more hit and miss, which is why I decided to play him in the capacity I did. But really like Coles and Valimaki, whether that's for DFS, whether that's for upside markets here, or, there's going to be other ways that we can probably figure out how to fit Coles, whether that's a top 40, a made cut, or anything else that comes into play over the next couple days. Because at this moment of us recording, we're still waiting for a lot of books to release matchups. So I have my fingers crossed that a Coles matchup gets put out there against an opponent that maybe he should not have been priced against and he should have been in a different range.
Yeah, love attacking safety with Coles there. And Spencer, you know what? I'm going to add an in-pod play. Noted that I've already got Coles on my outright card, but I'm adding Patrick Fishburne to my outright card. I just saw him pop back to 35 to 1 on Bet365. So I'm joining you there. I hadn't seen him above 30, or really mostly 28. So big difference there. I'm hopping in. I think that Keith Mitchell should be the favorite just because I I think Keith Mitchell should be one. I think Fishburne two, and then I'd have Seamus Power a little farther down because I just don't believe on a wide open golf course that it's going to. I think that he's going to be penalized off the tee a little bit. Players are going to be able to hit a few more par fives and attack some more par fours that he can't. But that's why I like Fishburne. He absolutely bombs the ball. His approach play has shown upside recently. And then also he made a change at the ISCO championship with his putter. He changed a bunch of stuff. He changed his putting grip, changed the actual putter, changed the loft on his putter as well. So big change there. And since then, he's played in 6 tournaments, gained big time in 4 of them, lost strokes putting twice. The only 2 times he lost strokes putting were on Bermuda when he's played on bent grass. Since that change, he has absolutely thrived, and that's the spot we're in this week. He's super long off the tee. So I think that anybody can play well on this golf course. I don't think you have to have length to be able to go low on this golf course, but I think to win, that's going to be a huge advantage. And I'd like to have guys who have that extra gear off the tee on my outright card, although Coles doesn't necessarily do that. I think that he has upside in other ways. And at 80 to 1 in this field, I thought that was a great number. But in order for me to back somebody sub 40 to 1 in this field, I wanted them to have that driver. I came in thinking, do I want to try to bet on only the elite drivers in this field just because there aren't that many of them, or guys who could potentially be elite? Maybe a Keith Mitchell, Patrick Fishburne, Chan Kim, potentially, even though he's not as long as I'd like him to be. Do I want to try to go that route? I just didn't want to get that much exposure on golfers whom I don't think are elite or even in that second tier, as we noted earlier. So I've got limited exposure this week. It worked for me last week. Added Kevin Yu very early in the tournament, and that turned out to be finally the week that Kevin Yu cashed. I'm thankfully not the boy who cried wolf on him, and we cashed both Kevin Yu and Steven Yeager at some point this year. So I think we're vindicated for our takes from 2023, Spencer. Glad to have the monkey off our back there. And so nonetheless, little tangent there. I got Fishburne on my card at 35 to 1 now. I've got Coles at 80 to 1. And then I'm also going back to the well with Mac Meissner at 50 to 1. That's what I bet him at. The best price right now that I can see him in legal space is at 45 to 1 on Bet365. I'll say it once again, just big fan of this young golfer. The putter is going to be the question for him, but ball striking wise, he's really solid, doesn't have weakness in his game. And I think the driver is going to be an asset for him. Approach play is as strong as just about anybody else's in this field. But once again, the putter is going to be the issue. And if he can find it on these bent grass greens, I think he's got as much upside as just about anybody else. And while there are a lot of golfers in the 30-ish to 1 range that I was surprised to see there, some of them might not have form, others just haven't played a lot lately or haven't had a high finish, even if they have been making cuts. I was surprised Mac Meissner wasn't in that range, and I've seen him go down to 35 to 1 at some books already. So I really like him, and I think you should hop on him the quickest among these that I've named. Spencer, any other plays on your card this week?
I mean, I have Seamus in a matchup against Bo Hostler. I got it at minus 125. That price has now moved out into the minus 130s. I would say, though, just with what the market seems to be doing right now, and I'm curious to see where some of these matchups end up entering, I do think we're going to get value on Seamus throughout different books and matchups. So I would keep an eye on that. I always talk about trying to find miscut equity on a lot of these bets. And this is going to be one of those rare situations where I'm just going to trust my model and back Seamus here. I agree, at least to some level, of what you said about Seamus, Roberto, where if you look at the par 5 scoring at just the basic level of it, and you look at some of these par 4 scoring marks, there are concerns. When I ran it from a course specific outlook, and this is where the problem comes into play, and we always talk about this, there's limited data and you don't want to get caught with this. That is where my model really liked them. And so if I end up being correct on my assessment that Seamus is one of the big climbers there, I do think Seamus does all of a sudden start possessing that win equity. But if it goes more into the territory where you are correct and maybe you need a little bit more distance, maybe you need a little bit more of that upside off the tee, there are problems that comes into it. But I just think Seamus right now, from like a safety perspective, is going to be about as safe of a golfer as you can find. So I'm trying to find matchups with him out there, and that would be something that I would recommend for everybody to do. And then if we just want to just very quickly talk about a couple outrights that I came close to getting to and I didn't get to. First one was Mac Meissner. Second one was Andrew Novak. Those are two names that were on my card last week. And there's definite trepidation that I feel of leaving those two names off. I'm, from a DFS outlook, going to play a lot of both of those two. Think it's a good spot for them last week. I think it's a better spot for them potentially this week. So I would not necessarily be jumping off the bandwagon with them. It's, as I said, you can't bet everybody, and sometimes names just come and go on the card. But I think those are two names that you should be considering. I looked into Doug Gim. I always seem to think that Doug Gim has more upside than what he maybe actually does possess. My model liked him a lot. Berger saw a very big increase in my model this week from where he was at a little bit before. I don't know if Gim and Berger can make enough putts to actually win. And that would be, I guess, my one concern for those two. But I would say those were probably the four names that were the closest for me to make the outright card. And they didn't get there. And I mean, anybody who's been paying attention this year, a lot of times it feels like one of those names that has been left off has unfortunately been the one that has won a lot of these tournaments recently. So I don't know. Everybody can do with that what they want at the end of the day. But I did think that 40 to 50 to 1 range had a lot of value to at least consider there.
I agree. There were some interesting options there. Berger, 7th place solo finish last week in the Chicken Championship, gained strokes throughout the bag, and what really stood out was the putter has heated up recently relatively to where it's been, which is one of the worst on the PGA Tour. Naturally, he's coming back from a back injury that held him out since the 2022 US Open before he came back early this season. And it's hard to practice putting because you got to bend over with a bad back, and that doesn't feel good. And in his first 14 tournaments this season with track data, he only gained strokes with his putter twice. In his last 6 tournaments, he's gained strokes with his putter 3 times. So there's certainly some very positive trajectory there. My question for Berger is that prior to last week, when he gained he gained exactly 1.2 shots for the whole tournament with his irons. He had lost strokes with his irons 5 straight tournaments before that. And he's not super long off the tee. He's more of a plotter. So need to get the putter, which may not have that much upside right now. Need to get the putter in good form. The iron play still isn't completely back to Daniel Berger form, and he's not a bomber. So I was close with him. I still think he's somebody to monitor this week. And if you see some more distance from him and the irons come out hot, maybe you back him or you find a way to back him in the tournament. But he's definitely somebody to keep an eye on because in a vacuum, he might have more talent than just about anybody else in this field. So if he keeps playing well in the fall, his number is going to continue to crash. A couple other golfers that stood out to me last week, Spencer, we were both on Michael Thorbjornsen in the 90-ish to 1 range. He's 45 to 1 this week. So I thought sometimes you make a great bet and the market corrects itself the next week and you just didn't get to cash it. But you had the top 20. I did not. So congrats to you. Great play there. And you took advantage of that. A couple other golfers who I was eyeing, Chan Kim always is the apple of my eye, just about always the first guy off my card. Like Keith Mitchell, but don't love Keith Mitchell at the price of 21 to 1. Best price there is Bet365. Jaeger, I thought also was a great fit for this course. And the putter, which after he won in Houston was terrible. It's now been solid the last 3 weeks, gained strokes putting each of his last 3 starts. So something to monitor there. He might be somebody to be an in-tournament bet for me, at least in upside markets. And then Hayden Springer and Cameron Champ were golfers who I liked because they're very long off the tee and they're really good putters. Hayden Springer got off to a pretty cool start earlier this season, but has been playing better golf. You'll remember he shot a 59 at the John Deere Classic earlier this season. And last week, he had his best putting week of the season, gained over 8 shots putting for the whole tournament. Really eye-opening there. Just about double his best other result of the entire season with the putter. He lost a ton of strokes with his irons, over 1.25 with his irons per round, but still managed to get a top 10. I don't think I've seen that at all this season. Obviously, the caliber of the field has something to do with that last week and the lack of tough around the green play and then also just the pure greens. But he's somebody to monitor. He hits the ball a long ways and he can really putt. And if his irons get hot, we know he shot that 59. And Cameron Champ, the ultimate top 10 or miscut guy. We talked about 3 golfers last week that I was considering for a miscut at plus 188. And one of the 3 hit, that was Cameron Champ. So if you made any of those bets, you came out just about even. If you didn't make any of those bets, it came out about even anyways. So he's somebody who I think could be worth an upside flyer. I wanted to get him 10-1 for a top 10, but best I could find is 7.5-1 where ties paid in full. So I passed on that, but he's somebody that might be interesting to add from a DFS standpoint if you want to add him in a big pool.
One of the things I always talk about on this show, and Jaeger has been the prime candidate of this long term, is I want to find golfers that are expected positive increasers on the surface that they're going to be taking on, whether that is bent grass here or easy bent grass putting, which is one of the weights that I ran on it. And I'm just going to very quickly rattle off a handful of the biggest climbers for me in expected putting on this course versus their baseline. So these are golfers that may or may not have the ball striking prerequisite that we want. A lot of these names do, which is why either I bet them or consider them. But these are golfers that are expected to see an increase with their putter. And that's one of the key things here when you're trying to find a golfer that can pop and get to 25 under par and maybe doesn't necessarily have that upside with the putter that you normally would. So Chris Kirk, Daniel Berger, Kevin Chappell, Rico Hoey, Steven Yeager, Patrick Rogers, Seamus Power, Alex Smalley, Patrick Fishburne. You just talked about Hayden Springer a second ago. Doug Gim. I don't know how many names I just rattled off there. That's like about the top 10 of the biggest substantial movers in positive putting. So those are names for me that I am keeping an eye on for DFS. Most of those names have playable commodities for there. And they also have maybe a little bit more upside than you typically would get for them because that flat stick might have the potential to spike.
I think that's a great note and something that's really important, especially with how volatile putting is from week to week.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I'm always trying to run it for a course specific outlook, just because of the volatility that you get there.
All right, Spencer, we've gone through all our bets. Let's run through a quick rapid fire of some other golfers whom we have not yet discussed because, as we noted, recording this Tuesday around 5 p.m. Eastern time. So not as many market specifically matchups are out there as we'd like. And so we're going to try to give you, the listener, as many opportunities to hear how we feel about golfers this week and their chances of being a fade candidate, somebody you want to back, or somebody where we want to keep a certain eye on something. So Spencer, let's jump into it. Keith Mitchell, outright betting favorite at 21-1. Kurt Kitayama is next on the board after Seamus Power, whom you've already bet, so we won't talk about him. Kurt Kitayama is 30-1. Did not think he would be the third favorite this week when on Monday morning. Beau Hossler is also 32-1, and Ryan Fox 35-1. We discussed him last week at 65-1 as somebody we liked. Among Keith Mitchell, Kurt Kitayama, Beau Hossler, and Ryan Fox, which outright number do you like the best?
I could probably do without all of those numbers. If you were to tell me what name would I feel most comfortable backing where they are, I will go with Keith Mitchell. I do believe Keith Mitchell for all the high-end talk that I've talked about with Seamus and even Patrick Fishburne. Keith Mitchell is right there from a projection standpoint, at least next to Fishburne. So, the rest of those names are probably overpriced in my mind because of one reason or another. For somebody like Hossler, it almost comes in just because of the result that he had last week. If you want to look at Kitayama, probably because we haven't seen him in action and we know that he can win on the PGA Tour. And it's almost like new blood is thrown into the contest. And because he's brand new into this field where you have a lot of the same names as of last week, there's almost this itch to try to bet him. But I think Mitchell, might be a little mispriced, but at least when we're looking for real win equity, he's the closest.
Spencer, I had a couple notes. First off, players who play well this week are going to see a jump in their prices next week because they're going right around the corner from you in Las Vegas for the Shriners Children's Open. So once again, another desert golf course at a certain level of elevation. So if you like somebody who plays well this weekend and you see their number on Monday morning and you think it might get even shorter, don't be afraid to bet on it because it's probably going to shrink given the narrative surrounding these next 2 weeks on the PGA Tour. Also, I noted that there was a par 5 that had a green complex similar to the 14th green at Pebble Beach on this golf course. It is the par 4 13th, which is a par 5 normally, but this week it's a par 4, which is why I was a little confused earlier. But just want to clean that up. Spencer, once again, moving down Chan Kim's 35 to 1. Chris Kirk is 37 to 1. Lucas Glover is 37 to 1. And your boy, Steven Yeager, also 37 to 1. Among Kim, Kirk, Glover, and Yeager, between 35 and 37 to 1, which outright price intrigues you the most?
I think we're starting to get very close again to Steven Yeager being worthwhile in consideration. When we talk specifically here for him on Bentgrass, one of the biggest climbers in my model, also a top 10 expected producer for driving approach play, and then adding in that putting. So that's a level that a lot of those guys that you mentioned don't quite hit on those marks. And I like Yeager this week. Didn't like him enough to actually get there in the outright market, but I feel like for what are we at now, Roberto? 3 months, 4 months where it's been me much lower on Yeager than I used to be. I think we're starting to ramp this back up again.
Yeah, he's had a lot of red on his data golf profile, specifically putting. Recently turned it around, gained over 4 strokes putting each of the last 2 tournaments in total, but the approach play has left him over the last 4. However, only one of them has been played in the last 2 months, and that was last week at the Sanderson Farms. So a lot to like for Yeager, at least from putting, and we know his ability to drive the ball is not going anywhere. He's still elite at that. Moving down the board, Eric Van Rooyen is 37 to 1. Ben Griffin is 37 to 1. We already touched on Andrew Novak, so we'll skip him. Michael Thorbjornsen is 45 to 1. And then Matt McCarty, along with Mac Meissner, are 45 to 1. So Van Rooyen and Griffin are 37. Thorbjornsen, Meissner, and McCarty are 45. Which one of those 5 golfers intrigues you the most outright?
I will say Van Rooyen. And it just stems back from there's 5 players that graded in the top 60 for me of every category. He was the one high-end name or one name in general that didn't make my outright card this week. So I think you said Meisner was included on that list. Like Meisner is every bit in that conversation. Also, Thorbjornsen, you touched on this a little bit earlier. That's the unfortunate nature of gambling is you can be so ahead of the market and yeah, if you hit a top 20 on him, it's great. But there's a lot of people that didn't reap the benefits of what was a really mispriced option last week. And that's, unfortunately a nature of the business. And I think now we might be pushing territory where we have way overcorrected it. So don't really have a ton of intrigue for him at that price. Although I will say my model likes him just fine this week. It's just, I don't know if you can move. Like I got him at 125 to 1 last week. I know he closed in that like give or take 100 to 1 range, but you move 70 points. That's a substantial movement.
Yeah, pretty ridiculous that you almost got from 125 down to 40 in some places this week.
Yeah.
Just shocking. I'm not sure I've seen that kind of movement week over week in a while on the PGA Tour. Continuing down the board, Alex Smalley is 50 to 1. So is Patrick Rogers. So is JJ Spawn. So is Adam Svensson. Your boy Doug Gim is there as well. And then Daniel Berger is also there. Among those at 50 to 1, Spencer, who stands out to you?
Probably Doug Gim for all the reasons that I talked about previously. Berger has some interest to him also. Thought the Patrick Rogers profile, my model is not necessarily one that finds itself overly optimistic on Patrick Rogers most week, but inside of the top 16 for most iterations of how I ran it. So sometimes when you get these outlier results of a player, it means more than the Doug Gim example where every single week Doug Gim statistically is popping in my model and providing a very, we'll call it subpar 31st place finish. So I think you could kind of mix and match those 3. I don't necessarily have a very strong take there. My model does like Doug Gim the most. That's kind of a very standard answer that it seems to come on this show quite often. But if you're shooting for pure upside, I mean, I know it's a weird answer to give for Patrick Rogers where he doesn't seem to win golf tournaments, but it's one of those venues where I do think he's very sneaky this week.
Yeah, he's got that driver putter build that the iron play can show up for him. He's got a lot of upside in this field. Continuing down the board, Patton Kizzire is 55 to 1. Harry Hall, English Harry, is 60 to 1. Matty Schmid is 60 to 1. Justin Lauer is 65 to 1. You already bet Chandler Phillips, so I'll skip him. Mark Hubbard is 65 to 1, and Jacob Bridgman is 70 to 1. So Kizzire, Hall, Schmid, Lauer, Hubbard, and Bridgman. Who stands out to you there, Spencer?
I think for the most part, those are all very similar options. Almost every single one of those players stretches somewhere between 20th and 30 something th in my model. Hubbard would technically be the highest when I ran this for volatility, which means a little bit more of a upside potential. And I understand Hubbard's like the same answer as Gim, where you're not necessarily getting that upside at the end of the day, but statistically, there's a lot to like about him. Um, Harry Hall is very close, also being inside the top 25 for the two main ones that I ran. And I feel like I have to show a little bit of love for UNLV after whatever that was against Syracuse last week in college football. Just horrible call at the end of the game there. And then I also didn't talk very, I guess, highly of Kurt Kitayama in comparison to a lot of the other names. So we need to draw this line back somewhere and get back onto this UNLV train.
Well, English Harry has played 3 events since the Wyndham Championship, which the last time he played on the PGA Tour. He played in the Betfred British Masters, tied for 12th, missed the cut at Royal County Down at the Irish Open, and then tied for 18th at the BMW PGA Championship at Wentworth, where Billy Horschel won in a playoff over Tristan Lawrence and Rory McIlroy. That was an awesome tournament, by the way. He's played some great golf, Harry Hall has, and he's able to jump across the pond because he's a winner on the PGA Tour this season at the ISCO Championship, where he chipped in that playoff win. So a little bit of job security. He's coming back because he likes this golf course, and it's probably a pretty easy trip for him residing in Las Vegas. I figure he plays this week and next week, and the iron play specifically has gotten a lot better over the last few months for Harry Hall. I think that's something that's very intriguing. You mentioned the UNLV football team. He's big enough to be playing linebacker, 6'4", 225, maybe not as fleet of foot as most of the other UNLV linebackers. But one thing that stands out to me about Harry Hall is he's a big guy, but he doesn't hit the ball super far. I'd love to see if he could do some speed training and put on add a few yards to his driver, because if this iron play continues to be improving, and we already know he's a great putter, he's gained strokes putting in, I believe, 10 straight tournaments. Watch out for Harry Hall, especially with a little bit of job security. Who knows, maybe a little bit less pressure for him. And going back to the desert these next 2 weeks, he's somebody that I'll keep an eye on as a potential in tournament play. Spencer, I'll get you out of here with this one. Rico Hoey is 70-1. Harris English is 75-1. Bud Colley is also 75-1. Cam Champ is 80-1. CT Pan's 85-1. And so is Nick Taylor. Among those guys, Hoey, English, Colley, Champ, Pan, and Taylor, who do you like the most for an outright bet?
I'll go with Rico Hoey. It feels like a very standard answer for me to give. That's a name that has been on a lot of my outright cards. On the weeks where I don't bet him, it's usually a very glowing review that I give for him on this show. I will say, as far as Harris English is concerned, like I talked last week of betting Chan Kim over Harris English, and English was one of the big fade candidates that I had on the board. I do think that he's a better fit for this course than he was last week, at least from what I can tell of what we're going to get here. It doesn't necessarily mean that he jumps into a super playable commodity, but big difference from a statistical perspective, where last week I had him outside of the top 55 in pretty much any of the statistical upside categories. He jumps into the top 40 this week. The price tag for DFS, the price tag in the outright market is going to make it so I don't get to him. But, I am interested to see where the ownership ends up residing, because I think for DFS, this is kind of the general range that we're looking at of these players, to where most of these options are very close to one another. Any of these names that you've named, for the most part, like in any of these tiers, most of them are separated by 5 to 15 spots in my model. And if you're telling me that we're going to have somebody, I don't know if it's going to be English, I don't know if it'll be somebody else, but if you're telling me that there is a name that is going to come in sub 5%, that starts to interest me for some of these dart throw type of names, to where nobody else is on them, because there are unknowns about this course. There's a lot of unknowns just about everything in general here this week. So I would be very cognizant of where ownership resides. And I think that that's something that maybe we can take advantage of here for DFS. For betting, it's a different answer. We're trying to find the name that's the most likely person to win. If we're talking outright betting, I'll go with Rico Hoey for that.
Harris English is fascinating. He last week had his worst week with his irons. He lost 2.28 shots per round, only 2 rounds because he missed the cut. That was his worst round with his worst tournament with his irons since 2018 in July at the Greenbrier. So long time of golf where he's not played that poorly with his irons. His irons have lost strokes in 4 consecutive tournaments and in 8 of the last 9. So nobody is going to be on Harris English. He could be a sneaky play, and he could be a sneaky play in some bigger pools, like you noted in DFS, because when he's playing well, he's got as much upside as anybody else in this field. And I believe he was a Ryder Cup player for the US at one point in his career. It's just not clicking for him right now for whatever reason. And there will be a buy point on him. We're just going to have to figure out when that is. So it'll be intriguing to follow that as the rest of the fall unfolds. We'll have you covered right here on the Links and Locks tournament betting previews. Spencer, glad to have our conversation this week. It was a blast as always. Where can the people find your work this week?
You can find me on Twitter at @TOffSports. I will have all my in-tournament bets, including for round one. We'll dive into this board a little bit deeper on Wednesday, but you can get all the in-tournament stuff as this tournament begins. And as always, you can go get my model over at Rotoballer. There's a lot of really, for tournaments like this, and it doesn't mean that we necessarily need to try to create such a wonky model, but there's an ability to play with the data in a way to see different iterations of how it gets built and to see where we can find an advantage from ownership in leverage situations. Where can we find an advantage in our statistical returns versus where the market is? So I do believe in a vacuum situation of it, it's tournaments like these that possess the highest ceiling potential to really get the answers right. There's going to be a lower floor that comes into play just because of the unknowns, but if you're not doing so already, you can get that model over there.
Highly recommend subscribing to Spencer's model. It's very easy to digest. You can play with the weights, and it's always something that I take a peek at before I make my outright bets. So could not recommend that enough. Also, our friend Nick Bretwish was unable to make the podcast this week, but you can tune in and hear his thoughts about the NFL on the First and Sticks podcast. You can find Nick on Twitter or X at SticksPicks, and that's Sticks with an X. Thanks again for all the fans for tuning in, for our producers, Noah Niederhofer, Matt Mitchell, and David Payne. This is your Black Desert Championship tournament preview, and we'll be back next week for the Shriners Children's Open down in Spencer's neck of the woods in Las Vegas, Nevada. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you next week.